Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keane Bhatt. I'm a senior associate for policy and strategy at the Democracy Collaborative, which is a nonprofit think tank committed to advancing the ideas and principles of community wealth building. And with me is my co-author, Steve Dubb, the co-author of a new report called Educate and Empower: Tools for Building Community Wealth. The two of us are very pleased to have with us a true wealth and resource of very prominent individuals who represent 3 organizations out of the 11 that were profiled in our recent report. That includes Dana Pedersen, who is the Education and Outreach Coordinator for Cooperation Texas, Aaron Brantley, who is the Executive Director for PUSH Buffalo, and Carla Javitz, the President and CEO of Rediff in San Francisco. And you can go to democracycollaborative.org/educate-and-empower to get a free copy, digital copy of the report. And with that, I just want to give a quick overview of the webinar this afternoon. As we launch, we are joined by 3 people in 3 different time zones, so we're very excited, and each is going to present a brief presentation of their work and how it connects to genuine empowerment for low-income stakeholders so that they can be the owners and protagonists in the economic development process. So first, my co-author Steve Dubb will give a quick presentation, followed by our 3 panelists, and then we will open up the floor for a robust question and answer period. So we will be taking all of your questions. So feel free to submit them through Google+, and I will be moderating them and passing them along to our esteemed panelists. So without further ado, Steve Dubb.
All right, thank you, Keane, for that introduction. And I want to start with the first slide, and this is just a title slide, but and I want to mention the other 8 cases just briefly. Market Creek Plaza, which is a comprehensive community development effort in San Diego, California. New Communities, another comprehensive-based community development corporation, in this case in Newark, New Jersey. Syracuse University and St. Joseph's Hospital in Sonoma County, California provide a couple examples of anchor institution-based strategies. Dudley Straight Neighbors, Inc. in Roxbury, which is a suburb or a neighborhood within Boston, very celebrated for its community planning expertise. Wellspring Cooperatives, a startup in Western Massachusetts that's developing employee-owned cooperatives. Ohio Employee Ownership Center, which provides technical assistance for conversions to employee ownership, both in the forms of ESOPs, employee stock ownership plan companies, and worker cooperatives. And Paraprofessional Health Institute, which is in the Bronx and grew out of something called Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is the largest worker cooperative in the United States with over 2,000 employees. So that gives you a sense of the overall scope of the report and the folks that we talked to. And really the focus of the report, next slide, is on building out how do you build expertise tap into external expertise while maintaining community accountability and control. And these are a bunch of different strategies that are effective for doing that. Just to mention one, the peer mentoring strategy, Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx has actually created peer mentor positions as part of their way to encourage worker empowerment. Next slide. We're also interested not just in education as pedagogy, but in building the sense of community. And some of our panelists, like Aaron, will talk, I'm sure, about door knocking community meetings. And one critical strategy really is that first one about study circles for planning. And author Jessica Gordon-Nembhard has actually written about how pretty much every African American cooperative that's been created in the United States came out of a study circle process. Next slide. We also look at the ability to build up institutions that can maintain community memory and knowledge over time. And one particularly important strategy is this idea of inclusive governance. And at Dudley Street, they actually have institutionalized this in their board structure. So there's 4 major communities that are in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston: Cape Verdean, Latino, African American, and white community. They each get 4 seats on the board of directors as well as 4 youth seats. And this becomes a conduit then for ensuring representation of all key community groups and making sure that there's consensus going forward for implementing strategies. Next slide. And a little bit more on the youth. I mentioned the youth development. One of the products of that at Dudley Street was that John Barrows, the former executive, started out as a youth member of that board, later became executive director of the organization, is currently chief of economic development for the city of Boston. So there really is a knowledge building that goes on through that strategy. Supportive networks, just briefly, mentioning Cooperative Home Care Associates. They're a unionized workplace as well as a worker cooperative, and they're also a B Corp, which expresses their social commitment. Next slide. We also try to talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy and the importance of long-term place-based investments to actually build community capacity over time. So this means moving away from sort of the annual grant cycle to multi-year commitments. One example in California, the California Endowment actually made 10-year commitments to 14 communities across the state. Next slide. We also look at the role of national intermediaries and the importance of building out economic institutions. So we try to highlight some groups that are doing this, including AORTA, which is the Anti-Oppression Resource and Trading Alliance, and Highlander, which has been involved in Southern grassroots organizing really since the 1930s in the days of the CIO. So next slide. So summing it up, these are some of the key themes that come out of the work. There's a lot of work on community history, the history of community organizing, going back to folks in the early 20th century like Jane Addams and John Dewey, and that and also a sense that this work at the community level can actually impact macro policy. It did so in the early 20th century and helped lead to the New Deal, and it's our hope at the Democracy Collaborative with Community Wealth Building and the Next System Project that I can do so again. So with that, next slide, I want to conclude. You can find out more resources on our website, and I want to pass the baton to Dana, who I believe is our first speaker.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today as well, and I'm honored and excited to share about Cooperation Texas. So let me just start by giving you a little bit of background about Cooperation Texas. Cooperation Texas started in 2009, and it started as a response to growing economic inequality in Texas. The original 3 founders started with the belief that everyone deserves access to dignified work, and that's work where people are earning living wages, have benefits, and have access to wealth-building opportunities. So from then until now, Cooperation Texas has aimed to create sustainable jobs, dignified jobs, and a more just economy through the development, support, and promotion of worker cooperatives in Texas. We're based in Austin, and thus far most of our work has been in Austin, although we're certainly not limited to Austin, and we kind of anticipate that our reach will extend over time. We have 2 bedrock programs at Cooperation Texas, the Cooperative Business Institute, or the CBI, and Education for Cooperation. The CBI is a training academy that consists of like 15 or 16 classes covering a wide range of topics, from Worker Co-op 101 to business planning, decision making, financing, governance, etc. And we take one group at a time through the CBI and really focus on developing their particular cooperative. Once they graduate from the academy, we do maintain an ongoing relationship with them to provide further technical assistance and support for their co-op. Also, as kind of an extension of the Cooperative Business Institute, we do public workshops and kind of like a la carte workshops by request for various groups in the community who might have a need for it. So that's the CBI. Our other program, Education for Cooperation, seeks to close the knowledge gaps around the nature and benefits of worker cooperatives. And the idea is that if we can spread the word about worker co-ops, then we can help create an environment where worker co-ops can thrive. So this program includes things like creating educational content, like written content, hosting public events like guest speakers. We've had Carla here, we've had Edward Nemhart here, and others. Film screenings and outreach to community-based organizations like churches, which is mentioned in the report, and other nonprofits. We are especially committed to low-income communities and communities of color in Texas, since these are the communities who are most adversely affected by the economic conditions we find ourselves in. And so from our perspective, it's critical to build power and build ownership from below, and that really greatly influences our approach both to the CBI and to education for cooperation. So we favor the popular education model, and this next slide is one rendition of the popular education approach. It's the spiral model. And you know, it can be complex, but at the heart of it is really this idea that learning begins with the experience and knowledge of the participants. And so starting there immediately disrupts the traditional power dynamic of an expert depositing information into passive recipients. And so that reconstitution of power is really what's part of the transformative nature of the popular education model. And so everybody is student and teacher. We start with our collective lived experiences and add new information to that and build from there. And so we see that really as a key ingredient for people to build agency and to build economic capacity. This next slide contains a few photos from some of the public workshops that we've done this year. And I chose these photos because I was trying to capture the spirit of our workshops. Our workshops are pretty interactive, and they're designed for people to engage and learn from each other as we draw on the shared knowledge and experience in the room. The next slide is a photo taken after Carlos and I conducted a Worker Co-op 101 workshop with the Taxi Drivers Association of Austin. They are currently in the process of trying to form a taxi cab co-op, which is a long process. And at the time, they needed to get their membership, their rank and file members, on the same page about what a worker co-op is and what a driver-owned cab company might look like. And so we went on site to their assembly meeting to conduct this workshop. This one was definitely on a much larger scale than our typical workshops. I think there were like 100 plus taxi drivers in the room for this workshop, but the need was there, and we went, and it was really awesome. My final slide is just a snapshot of a recent flyer we had for a study group that's happening right now about Jessica Gordon Nemhart's book, Collective Courage. And so most of it's a small group. Most of the group members are African American, and we spend a lot of time talking about what are our lived experiences with regard to economics in Austin, which is a really interesting question given the larger discourse about what Austin is like and what's happening in Austin. So what are our lived experiences? And we're talking about that in tandem with this longer history of Black cooperative economics. So the study group becomes both a place of outlet for our experiences and input as far as increasing and building our knowledge. And it's our hope and intention that these kinds of initiatives foster the cohesion and collective knowledge needed to advance worker cooperative development and, by extension, community wealth here.
Thank you, Dana. We are going to turn to Aaron Bartley, the Executive Director of PUSH Buffalo, who will talk a bit more about his incredible work.
Thank you, Keane. Hello, everybody from Buffalo, New York. If we could just start with the crowd scene slide. Start with this slide because just wanted to represent that PUSH, first and foremost, is a social movement organization. And we see ourselves working at the intersection of various social movements for climate justice, for racial and economic justice. And this is a scene from the New York City Climate March last year, a chance to really start putting those pieces together. And we work under a just transition framework where we're working to move our neighborhoods in Buffalo forward for the future, both in terms of limiting the extractive environmental economy that we've been living under, as well as the extractive labor and other types of oppression. So how do we do that? On the ground, the next slide is an ongoing community planning process. It's iterative, it never ends. We've experimented with it over the course of the 10 years that we've been working. We build a base of members on the west and to some extent the east sides of Buffalo. And we've designated a 25-block district in which we plan for the future. And we plan, if you can go to the next slide, the map slide, we've planned for what we're calling our Green Development Zone. It's a 25-block district. There are about 7,000 people living in the zone. There are 50 languages spoken in the zone, refugees resettled from all over the world, as well as older post-industrial communities. And each plot in the zone is a chance to move forward when it comes to resilient communities, sustainable communities. So it may be a vacant lot turned into a community garden. It may be a vacant home turned into a highly efficient net zero home. Every parcel is a chance to really practice our community planning that we preach. So next slide, the vacant property slide. When we started 10 years ago, we were experiencing about 25% vacancy on the west side of Buffalo. People were walking away from their homes left and right. And we came in a moment when, after building a base of members in the community through community organizing, knocking on doors, leadership identification, we're able to start practicing community development pretty quickly by taking over vacant property and transforming it into the next slide, affordable housing. And we're working in a district that's kind of curious in that it both was disintegrating, the housing was disappearing due to demolition, and it was also on the borderline of a gentrifying neighborhood, Elmwood Village. So we knew that we needed to gain a lot of control all at once to sort of preempt gentrification because Buffalo had already started to get a little bit of a sort of a hipster feel to it, and we wanted to make sure that folks who'd been struggling on the west side of Buffalo could experience growth and stay there over time. So at this point, we've acquired 110 parcels as an organization in that district, and have moved all of them really forward, either as affordable housing or other green ventures that I'll talk about later. Next slide, jobs rebuilding the community. One key piece of the work is to recognize that every site on the west side of Buffalo is a potential job site. There's work to be done, whether it's weatherization, renewable energy, urban agriculture, basic construction on every single parcel of property. And it's really the lack of proper allocation in our current economy that doesn't allow the work to get done. It's not that the work doesn't exist, it's that the resources to do the needed work don't exist. So we've been fighting for those resources and proving our capacity to get the work done. So that includes extensive job training, extensive pathways to employment in the various sectors we work in. The next slide, the neighborhood of the future, that's just a look at one of our more experimental uses, which is a vacant lot turned into a geothermal heating field that's connected to our net zero home in a district and a cluster of super efficient homes. And you can go to the next slide also. That's a look at the net zero home from an aerial perspective. We do those projects both to sort of prove the capacity of our neighborhood to become a resilient community, to create jobs in the process, to create training pathways, but also to gain experience so that we can work at a systems level, both through advocacy and organizing to create public policies that support the replication of resilient communities, as well as providing services that allow us to gain community wealth. So in the case of weatherization and renewable energy, we aggregate homes, not just on the west side of Buffalo, but throughout the million-person Erie County region. We aggregate weatherization projects, and we've created a system where we bundle 10 homes together at a time and leverage that power, our place in that economy, to extract job pathways, job commitments, better wages for folks doing those projects. Next slide, the urban farming slide. Again, the Rust Belt cities offer a lot of potential when it comes to mixing in agriculture, stormwater management right into the neighborhood context. This was a plot that had experienced demolition, and now it is a beautiful community garden. You go to another picture of that garden, and then go to the slide that says green infrastructure. Green infrastructure really is one of the most important sectors for us at this point. It's, because of the EPA's enforcement orders in Buffalo, we have a growing market for neighborhood-based green infrastructure. And because we were able to experiment with rain gardens, bioswales, green roofs in our community over the past 4 years, we're really well positioned to get a much bigger piece of that wealth and bring it home for workers that are coming right out of our very low-income communities. So, example of that, the jobs in the community slide, the next slide, that's our stormwater management crew. They've gone from doing 30 projects in the Green Development Zone to 200 projects across the city of Buffalo in partnership with the Buffalo Sewer Authority at prevailing wage. So these are really good jobs. It's a growing unit. We're also starting to serve the private sector. Next slide, the Push Green slide. Again, the weatherization is, in our view, a great wealth builder, especially when combined with solar and other renewable technologies. And we've just incorporated solar as a new option in our aggregation pilot. And then lastly, the community organizing campaign slide. None of this work really means much to us unless we're building power and creating systems change. And so that may mean that we're confronting, in the case of that slide, a gas utility that really wasn't doing its part with conservation funds it was already collecting from customers. It wasn't open to community input, and moving them to a place where they are integrating their funds into a wealth building strategy at the community level. On a more broad level, we're really working towards energy democracy in New York State with a coalition across New York State to put it at the forefront, to put New York at the forefront of making sure renewables and energy efficiency are building wealth in communities. And I'll leave it at that. The last slide shows some of the impact we've had, some of the numbers around the scale of the investment, both on the west side and across the city and the state. So thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. Next is Carla Javitz, Executive Director of Rediff, which is a very impressive and very large-scale social enterprise accelerator and incubator and supporter. So without further ado, Carla, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm really thankful to be here today, and I also wanted to just express my appreciation to the Democracy Collaborative for doing this great set of case studies so that we can learn from one another. Really important, so thanks for doing that. Rediff was founded 18 years ago. We worked first in the San Francisco Bay Area, then statewide, the state of California, and now we're just launching national growth. We're very excited about that. And sort of our core value is that we believe that everyone, everywhere, who wants a job should have that opportunity to work. So basically what we do is we help communities create jobs for people who face some of the most significant barriers to work, people who may have faced a history of homelessness, incarceration, young people who are disconnected from school and work. And we do this by supporting social enterprises. Generally, these have been nonprofits at the community level that provide both jobs and support to give people that first chance to work. And we provide the money and the business advice to help them grow. And then we go into communities and try to build out the ecosystem, do that community building to support the employment of these individuals, their job retention, and their potential to advance into, as we heard earlier, kind of dignified work. The way that we do this is we assist the business with growth, so to create more jobs, the capabilities so that they can scale up, that might be infrastructure, talent, look at new lines of business, the market, what's going to work, and then on the social support side, kind of what they can do to help people keep a job, skill up, move up, and then move on to next step employment in sort of the mainstream economy. And the relationship that we try to cultivate with the organizations we work with is highly engaged, and it's really based on trust, respect, and honesty. We as a funder understand kind of the power dynamic in our role, and we really try to build an honest relationship so that we can do the best work possible with the groups that we work with. Next slide. In terms of resources for grantees, we provide the resources that we do in a variety of different ways, some through our own staff, some through consultants. We also have an MBA internship and fellowship program. And some of the kind of innovations in the way that we work with the organizations, for example, include a monthly meeting when we're really going over with them their financial and social results for the business that they're operating, the people that they're engaging with. We discuss and identify ways to resolve the problems that they may be having together. And then we have a very keen focus on social outcome measurement to try to make sure that what is being done is actually achieving the objectives that the organizations have. On the next page, the next slide, we kind of provided a little more detail on the way that we provide business assistance. We look, for example, in depth at the kind of supports that employees need in order to succeed on the job, how to design the jobs, the supervision, the type of job, so that people can learn and succeed. We work on business mentorship, business development, also contracts and procurement, trying to make sure that these nonprofit-run businesses access the market and are able to sell the goods and services that they have. We work very hard with the groups on the use of data, so that data is not just something to use to convince funders that what they're doing is a good idea, but that the people who are working in these organizations can really get a sense of what's happening in real time, what's working, what's not, and make improvements along the way. And then we do sort of business feasibility analysis, market research, and that kind of thing for the growth of these businesses. On the next slide, I just tried to give an example, in addition to helping these individual organizations run successful businesses that do a good job kind of giving people the skills that they need in order to get jobs in the mainstream economy. We also really work on trying to create that ecosystem of support in the business community, government, philanthropy, among other nonprofits, so that more people can go to work. Really support for this notion that everybody should be employed if they in fact want to work in a community. And we've done some work around this, particularly in Los Angeles, in the context of a project we call LA Rise. The Workforce Board in LA got a big workforce innovation grant from the federal government, and we're partnering with them as sort of the convener and advisor. And that involves 25 different organizations, nonprofits, government, philanthropy, and business, really to create this kind of core of successful social enterprises to give people that first chance to work, other mainstream businesses that are sort of leaning in, if you will, to try to employ these individuals once they're ready for work, a whole tier of support services so that the people employed are getting the right kind of supports as they move along, and then training services through the community college and other formats that are helping people kind of skill up so that they can move up the career ladder once they get into the workforce. On the next slide, we just kind of give you a general sense of our overall results to date. So far, 10,000 people have gotten jobs. The nonprofits that we've worked with have earned $150 million in business revenue. We've assisted about 60 social enterprises. And as I said, we've really been working primarily in California, although We've tried to do a lot to share what we know around the country, but we've just launched most recently a national competition for funding. We're very, very excited about that. We're part of the Social Innovation Fund, which is a federal program that's trying to lift up kind of promising efforts at the community level. And so on the last slide, I just tried to offer some ways that we could get engaged with one another. We would welcome that. We have a free membership group called SE for Jobs. We just hosted our quarterly call to try to bring people together and provide informative information, just very much like this call. There's also the Social Enterprise Alliance, which is the National Trade Association for Social Enterprise. They have local chapters. You can check them out. And then we've launched a new website that we call REDFworkshop.org. It's a free learning portal, and we've really loaded it up with kind of everything we've learned, and we also are intentionally trying to get people involved around the country so that it can be an ongoing platform for people to share information and ideas and kind of move the field forward. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Carla. So, you know, in the course of this research, I had the immense privilege of being able to visit all 11 case studies that are profiled, and in person I've been able to, including the 3 organizations that are being represented today. So I'm going to kick off the question and answer period with a few quick questions, and then we will be opening it up to all of your questions that you'd like to ask Carla, Erin, and Dana. But I just want to make a quick comment that it's really remarkable when you get to see all of these 3 organizations in person, how critical the human development is to the community development. And you know, all 3 are very exemplary cases of that. So I'd like to go back to Dana and ask you, Dana, what has been one of the most surprising things that has arisen and in the work that you've done at Cooperation Texas, and what are some of the challenges that you've confronted?
Dana, you're muted.
How about now?
That's great.
Okay. Thanks, Keane. I was just saying I've been with Cooperation Texas for about 8 months, and so my organizational memory is comparatively short. And I also want to add that when I came on board, the executive director, Carlos, I think, did a pretty good job in explaining to me what to expect. So there haven't been too many surprises, but I think one interesting thing that I've discovered is that there are quite a bit of silos in this work. And what I mean by that is that I may encounter people who know a lot about housing co-ops, for example, and virtually nothing about worker co-ops, right? And those are people who their values are aligned with ours and could be key partners and allies in this work, and yet there's a need to kind of whittle down these silos between different kind of cooperative sectors. So there's some interesting partitioning of information even within the kind of larger co-op community that needs to be addressed in order for this to be effective. I think one of the biggest challenges, and in some ways this is like kind of existential, is that on some level this work has to do with like a transformation inside of a person as it relates to how they see themselves in relation to work, economy, power, and all those kinds of things. And so on some level, you know, it's more than simple transmission of information. There's a real psychological component to it, and that internal shift, it can take a long time. It can be slow, and the fruit of it is not always immediately apparent, if it's apparent at all. So there's that piece of it that is a little deeper than the kind of day-to-day, we're doing workshops, we're in the community, we're developing co-ops. There's something inside of people that's also shifting, and that's a very difficult thing to tap into, and it takes a long time. But I think ultimately that's what keeps people sustained and involved in these efforts to build community wealth.
Yeah, I'd like to encourage folks, thank you, Dana, but I'd like to encourage folks, if you're not on Google+, to go into the Google Hangouts and ask your questions right into the that main question and answer bar, and I will be pitching them to our panelists. I'm going to turn to Aaron now. You know, I had the pleasure of visiting Aaron in the dead of winter in Buffalo, and it was really remarkable to see all of the different approaches in terms of capacity building and education with so many different stakeholders. So, you know, Aaron and his organization were building capacity for, you know, low-income neighbors, you know, organizers, community developers, city government, state policymakers, anchor institutions like universities and hospitals, and even philanthropic groups. So I guess what I'd like to ask Aaron is how your approaches have shifted over time, given all of the remarkable levels that PUSH Buffalo is operating with.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting, Keane, that we may need to focus our mission a little bit more. We're working in a lot of different realms. I think, you know, that to some extent comes out of the needs of a community. They're not, you know, singular. They're not unintegrated. People's lives touch a lot of different sectors and a lot of different issues and a lot of different, you know, ways of thinking, analytical, emotional, a lot of different experiences. So, you know, just even within the organization, the capacity building has become much more complex, and I think we have a challenge of making sure that it's a little more integrated because it can be disparate. Like you said, we have a leadership development curriculum for just grassroots members who are becoming part of our organizing campaigns. We have a different education program for folks who are coming onto our staff to become weatherization experts, you know, energy advocates. We have a different education track for folks that are entering our green infrastructure division. And, you know, the risk is that we forget, you know, what is it that ties all of these pieces together. And for us, really, increasingly, that is a measure of political education for no matter what the individual or the group is doing with relation to PUSH. It's really introducing principles of just transition, of community wealth building, of new economy thinking, in ways that, you know, I think, you know, as Dana said, get people to see themselves in relation to power, in relation to the economy as actors, not simply as people who are experiencing it without power. So, you know, that we're doing our best. I think I would just also say, you know, at the level of state policy and state organizing, we just have a big opportunity in New York around energy democracy and around the fact that the governor has sort of thrown open the question of what will happen to the electric utility in the new energy regime. And so that is an example of something that we just, you know, we felt like we had to step up to it because of the moment. And I think we're all in that sense of, you know, these are some grave, critical times for climate and inequality and race, and it's really about stepping up wherever we can.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. And then my question to Carla, and before I ask that, I would ask our audience members to submit their questions on Google Hangouts, and I will ask them for you. But Carla, when I visited you, what I was really struck by with Rediff is just the intensity of barriers with the folks that you are empowering. I mean, these are folks that are coming from you know, chronic homelessness, people with you know histories of substance abuse, and the way that you have been able to, you know, bring literally thousands of these people with some of the most challenging backgrounds in terms of access to education and the labor market is really remarkable. And I guess you know, one thing that I wanted to ask you is how critical has it been to focus on these kinds of ecosystems of support for, you know, building up this capacity?
Yeah, well, I think what we're interested in is not just that people sort of get that first job, and as you said, these may be people who haven't worked in a very long time, or as we found from kind of the most recent data that we looked at, fully 1/4 had never had a legitimate wage-paying job. So we're really trying to help people get into the workforce who really may not ever have been there, and to make that successful requires both, we believe, a new kind of tier of business, if you will, that we call social enterprise, that's very mission oriented. But for those entities to be successful requires not just a nonprofit to decide to run a social enterprise, but it requires running a business, and that in and of itself means some other business or consumer needs to buy the goods and services that they sell. So in and of itself, that requires the ecosystem to get involved. And then we very much want to see, once people get a job, that they're able to move on into, from that kind of supported work environment where they may be with a lot of people who have faced the same kind of challenges, into mainstream work where they can kind of move on and move up. And that, in turn, requires companies that may traditionally have shut their doors to hiring these individuals, or whose employment practices may not cultivate their success, to become involved and to get interested in doing that, and to open up kind of their practices so that these individuals can get hired and be more successful on the job. So again, that's a community building effort. And then lastly, certainly with the government and philanthropy, they are primarily used to supporting things that are 100% not-for-profit in nature, and it's somewhat confusing and can be challenging to get the kind of support that's needed for double bottom line operations that are, doing a business and at the same time offering kind of a social service, if you will. And so I think for philanthropy and government, it's really engaging them so that they really understand the value and kind of think differently about the ways that they provide support for entities that may, on the one hand, be sort of trying to generate a profit, if you will, but at the same time, delivering social benefit. So, building that ecosystem is just critical.
Great, thank you. So, Dana, I'd like to turn to you. We've got a question from Elizabeth McMeekin, and she says that we work in an area where the history and experience with cooperatives is very limited. Any suggestions of where and how to start the educational process to help create this kind of consciousness, and maybe the education for cooperation spaces?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good one. I think Cooperation Texas found itself in a similar situation back when it started. As a matter of fact, Carlos and the other co-founders did not set out to create a nonprofit worker co-op incubator. That wasn't their original aim. They set out to create a worker co-op cafe, and then discovered that there was a real need for technical assistance, development, education in Texas, and moved in that direction. We're still the only place like this in Texas. So I think I certainly understand those roots. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think from my perspective, I think it's good to start small, because sometimes when you jump out and you're like, I'm going to do this, and it's going to be the biggest and best thing ever, and suddenly everyone's consciousness will be raised and everybody will understand. That's a hard momentum to sustain. It starts small. Start with the people you know. Start with your personal network. There's actually a lot of material available. It's kind of like what we're doing right now with this reading group with Jessica Gordon-Emhart's book, right? Like, reaching the African American residents of Austin is an important goal for us, right? How are we going to do that? We start to gather people together and read and talk about what we're reading and start there. So I think that would be the one suggestion I would make, is to start small, start with what you have, and it's a long haul. It's a marathon and not a sprint, and so being prepared for that as well. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there for
Great,
now.
thank
And
you.
question.
So I'd like to ask my panelists to just let you know that we've got some great questions, a lot of questions coming in. So if, however briefly you can answer the question, I know that that's a tough request, but please do so if possible, just so we can get to everyone. This one comes in from Eric Freef. He's interested in other panelists' thoughts regarding Dana's point on the psychological shift regarding community wealth movement and related movements, particularly on ways organizations and individuals can facilitate, speed up, and catalyze that process through their work. So maybe I'll pitch that to Aaron. What's your thoughts on that psychological component?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we all know that the dominant system really inculcates a consumerist way of experiencing the economy that's pretty passive, that's about a transaction. And so that, to me, goes back to that sort of what Manuel Pastor and others have really popularized, the idea of transformational change that hits on multiple parts of our lives. And for PUSH, I would say just the way to make that real is people's social lives have changed. Their whole understandings of what's possible has changed, and their access to resources and self-awareness around not just the economy, but their relationship to their neighbors. And so, you know, all of that can't help but have emotional, psychological elements to it. I think, you know, we've done some work internally. I'll just end by saying a lot of work internally lately in the last year or so around emotional intelligence within our own staff and membership, and that is about self-reflection. Some of it comes back to, you know, we have a very growing Buddhist community, for example, on the west side of Buffalo, the Burmese refugee community, and we've learned a lot from them around self-reflective potential.
This one, actually, I'm going to pitch to Steve. This is a very quick one. Up front, this from Brian Dowling. He hasn't read the report yet, and he gets the community wealth building idea, but is there a definition, a quick definition for community wealth as opposed to individual wealth or family wealth or family business wealth?
Sure. Thanks, Keane. So the simplest definition of community wealth is using community forms of ownership of business to build wealth in low-income communities. So cooperative, for instance, is owned by community members. A nonprofit social enterprise is responsive to the community as a whole. So that's the central idea, is to try to shift ownership of business to members of low-income communities, which is important given that more and more of wealth is actually tied up in capital and less is going to wages in the United States.
Great, thank you. This one I'm going to ask Carla about. This is from Mariah McKay. She asks, in Spokane, Washington, our community foundation is only interested in charity giving. Nonprofits coach on traditional business development, and there's no political advocacy with low-income people in our community, and our energy retrofit jobs project failed. So do you have any advice on what community foundations can be doing and what advocates can be thinking about in terms of, you know, moving beyond simply charity giving?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this comment when you asked the question about psychology, and I think in the face of intransigence, one thing I've found that's very helpful is to draw people's attention to things that are working, that are accessible to them. So I think, you know, with community foundations, there are community foundations, certainly in California and in other parts of the country, including Chicago and others, that are supporting these sort of double bottom line business efforts and things like that, and they've done it very successfully. So I think sometimes if you can find examples that are similar enough to the people, you know, who you're trying to convince, and show them that it's working, because sometimes I find you talk to them and they say, well, this can't be done. And if you can say, no, it actually can be done, it is being done here, look how successful this is, how exciting this is a way for you to get involved. I think if you can show people that path to engagement, that's often really helpful. And, you know, to the extent that you can provide it, you know, just data and information on then the results of these positive things that have been done, sometimes that can be motivating.
Great, thank you. I'd like to just throw in a quick plug for a previous report from the Democracy Collaborative by our Vice President Marjorie Kelly, which is called A New Anchor Mission for a New Century, Community Foundations Deploying All Resources to Build Community Wealth, in which they profile a number of really great community foundations going beyond charity giving into really thinking about how to have the greatest amount of impact and economic wealth building strategies with their philanthropic dollars. Okay, I'd like to ask maybe Aaron about this, and then maybe Dana. You know, how did you get involved in this work? Did you begin with grassroots advocacy or traditional nonprofits? This is coming from Leanne Hernandez.
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I got involved through the labor movement. I was sort of pretty shiftless after college, didn't really know what I was going to do. I took a organizing internship in a janitor's organizing campaign in Denver, Colorado with SEIU. This is 1996, and it gave me a lot of hope. I started to see that organizing actually, you know, worked if you did it right, and could be, you know, empowering at a lot of different levels, and also could just have material change. So I was hooked from that point on. And then with PUSH, after I went to law school, I didn't ever think I was going to really practice law. I did a lot of organizing during law school, and a few years after that I was back in the labor movement, and moved back home 11 years ago now to Buffalo, and applied the organizing skills that I gained in other places, and with one other co-founder, Eric Walker, got PUSH off the ground coming up on 11 years ago.
Aaron, while I have you on the line, maybe you could clarify for one of our viewers from Milwaukee, what is a just transition?
Yeah, so just transition ideas really come down to the idea that both our environmental practices and our labor practices have been very extractive in the history of the United States and capitalism generally. So we extract coal without thinking about what the long-term repercussions are. We burn carbon without thinking about repercussions. Same with our labor regime, whether it's, you know, hyper-exploitation of slavery or wage exploitation. It's really, you know, extracting wealth from people without thinking about what are the repercussions of doing that for a society. So a just transition is moving towards an economy that has environmental practices that are sustainable and labor practices that are sustainable. And community wealth building is a key example of one of those practices, as are co-ops, and anything that's democratic and allows wealth to be shared and you know, practiced democratically.
Mm-hmm. This I'll ask Dana, and then I'd like to go back to Aaron and Carla about this, because I think this is important. What are the most useful state and city policies that have worked to support the kind of work that you're doing? Are there good models for that? That's from Alyssa Sloan, by the way.
Yeah, that's an interesting question for us at the moment. Up until very recently, Cooperation Texas has not put a lot of time and energy into the policy piece of our work. So that's like a recent addition to our focus. You know, to my knowledge, so far there hasn't been anything locally that's been a clear, concrete thing policy-wise to support our work. One thing that's happening right now, we have been starting to move some pieces and push on the city a little bit, and they are sitting on a pot of money that they do want to give to the development of cooperatives in Austin, and you know, working with city council and with city budget is a long process, and so that's still unfolding. But that's like a recent development for us, and it remains to be seen how that will play out. I know that just kind of generally speaking, particularly in Austin, there's a culture that really values local business and small business, and we understand that city contracts are willing to contractors are willing to prioritize doing business with minority-owned businesses, small businesses, local businesses, things like that. What would it mean for our co-ops, particularly our worker co-ops, to be lumped into that and also get priority consideration for city contracting? I think that's a key thing that could happen that would really help our work. Yeah. There's also things like the city's small business center, and One thing that happens rather frequently is we've got these small business owners who are nearing retirement age. Their kids don't want to take over their business. They don't necessarily want to close it down. They're at a loss for what to do. What would it mean for the city to recommend us as an option to assist with a conversion from a sole proprietorship to a worker-owned business or something of that nature? So there are some things, kind of policy, city-related, that we're trying to start to push on, but thus far there hasn't really been anything concrete.
Yeah. Aaron, so we only have a few minutes left, but I think that's an important question for both you and Carla. I know that you've been doing a lot of city and state level policy work in order to create the conditions for successful business, and I know Carla has very national ambitions to try to, turn social enterprise innovation into a national, phenomenon that actually has a significant share of the U.S. economy, which is very ambitious. So I'd like both of you to just weigh in for a brief, minute or two.
Sure. So two policies that are really important to us right now, really actually both come out of the EPA. One is the enforcement of the Clean Water Act through the combined sewer overflow regulations that are coming down in 70 different cities that are really dictating more infrastructure being built in neighborhoods through green infrastructure at a large scale. We're talking $40–50 billion market nationally. And the question is, will communities really be able to claim some of this wealth, revitalize their neighborhoods while creating wealth doing green infrastructure? Another one would be on the energy side, the 111D process that's really just getting going. And that process is about what is the future of renewable energy vis-a-vis dirty energy in each state. And for us, we've already started that work with New York around something called the Reforming the Energy Vision. The question comes down to who's going to end up owning the solar resources and the other renewable resources as they grow over the next 20 years. Will it be large conglomerates, or will it be collectives, cooperatives, individuals, more on the German model? So we're really focusing on that. And then just lastly, any kind of public subsidy is a great opportunity to win community benefits. So we have a lot of subsidized economic development here in the Buffalo area, state subsidies, city subsidies, and it's really about us holding the recipients of those subsidies accountable, as well as those giving the subsidies accountable to living wages, workforce pathways, procurement goals.
Great. Carla?
Yeah, reflecting on what Dana had said earlier, procurement is really important, and those policies around minority and women-owned business don't right now include certain businesses, including social enterprises. Nonprofits don't qualify, and at the end of the day, it's the Small Businesses Administration at the federal level, and then Congress that could, may have to modify. Some of these are regulatory, some of these are by law, and then local governments, obviously local jurisdictions can also put in preferences, just as Dana said, and that can happen for companies that do more to employ the populations that we're talking about. So that's one thing. Second would be like the Community Reinvestment Act, as we all know, channels a lot of money from banks into the community, especially through CDFIs. There haven't been many cases of direct investment in social enterprise that have sort of proven their way through the regulatory process so that banks are assured that making those investments qualify for CRA credit. That would be second. And then third, for the people who are involved, because we know that it may be, even with all the fights that are going on minimum wage, that people are being paid less than they need in order to have a decent life, we really need expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit program. California has just gone out and expanded, put in a tax credit at the state level, and has included individuals who don't have children in that. It's very important, and I think that needs to happen nationally as well as at the state level.
Great. I just want to say that it's been a real honor to speak with all of our panelists and to be able to visit them and amplify and raise up all of their kinds of innovative practices. You can access that report by going to democracycollaborative.org. It's called Educate and Empower: Tools for Building Community Wealth. I'm going to finish with one final question, which I'd like to pitch to my co-author, Steve. As someone who's pursuing a bachelor's who would like to work in the field of community wealth building, what are the most useful fields of study to get involved in? That's from Owen Sechrist.
That's a I think there's opportunities in a whole bunch of different fields. So, I do think you could look at urban planning as one option, or agricultural economics if you're looking at rural development. But really, in any field, whether you're going into health, education, the law, there are opportunities and needs in communities, and it's really about applying, getting a broad education, applying principles, and getting to interact. Basically, I'll give a personal example. My studies were on political science, but my actual work was in cooperatives on the side. That wasn't through my classes, and so I think it's important to be grounded in community in this work as much, and that's as important as the degree you get.
Great. And I just want to mention that there are emerging courses, for example, in cooperative management. So this is a kind of a new phenomenon which has been around in Europe and Canada and elsewhere, but now we're beginning to see how management with a cooperative vision is also a field of study today. Anyway, I'd like to thank again my wonderful panelists who were all profiled in our report, Educate and Empower. Tools for Building Community Wealth, which you can get at democracycollaborative.org. Feel free to continue sending questions to press@democracycollaborative.org, and we will continue this conversation. Thanks again so much for all of your time and insights.